So what we're working through now is the sort of 3 stages, really, of coming to grips with a problem. So, in other words, you start off with awareness, and we've had a fantastic session there, making us aware of the issues that we're trying to talk about. Now we want to move to understanding. And so I'm really hoping that you're going to come up with a lot of really difficult questions. Because when you get into plastics recycling, there's a lot of false information out there, and people read something and they're not quite sure, and so on and so forth. And if you've ever done a sales course, and I was a commercial guy, you know that you can't sell a benefit, the benefit of recycling, until you deal with the objections. So, you know, for all those business people in the room. So what we want to do now is we want to get all the objections out on the table. So hit us as hard as you like, because you're going to be hitting my friend Adrian, and I'm going to take cover if I lose the seat again. I'll introduce Adrian Griffiths, and as good, we'll get you, Adrian, please, to introduce yourself.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. It's very good to be with you. So over the last sort of 10 or 12 years, I've spent most of my life actually thinking about carbon in the environment and plastic. And I have to say that I actually, well, I hope there's some slides going to come up in a moment. It's a little prop for the folks at the back. I think plastic is a fantastic material. And I think that because I'm actually really, really worried about an even bigger threat, and that's carbon in the environment. And I think plastic actually has an enormous part to play in actually providing us a low carbon way of living. Because it's all very well to actually say, we don't want straws and we don't want the lids on the cups. And I go, absolutely, get rid of them. If there is no utility value in any resource, we should not use it. We live on a finite planet, and we should only use things, anything, carefully. But actually, there are times where you need material, and you need something to put something in. You need a bottle. Now, should it be a glass bottle, or should it be a plastic bottle? Well, bear in mind that the plastic bottle is always an enormous amount lower carbon footprint than the glass bottle. And so if you can...
You talk a bit slower, because not everyone has English as a first language.
Very good. I will try and take that on a little bit. So
you're entitled to throw things if you do.
And so now that I have the slides as well, I'm going to move this chair so that maybe you can actually see a little bit of the slide as well. So this is a slide coming from the Nova Institute. And the reason that I talk about plastic being a brilliant material is a lot of people would initially question the first premise of this slide, that plastic is going to grow from about 400 million tons in 2018 to over 1.2 billion tons in 2050. And the first reaction that you might have to that is to say, oh, for goodness sake, we want less plastic, not more plastic. And I would always say, when you need a material, what you want is less carbon, not more carbon. And so actually, as an environmentalist, I can get very comfortable with the fact that plastic is going to grow, and grow at these sorts of scales by 2050. But what I also want to draw out from this slide here is that the black piece on the 2018 column is plastic which is coming from fossil sources. And so the vast majority of plastic today comes from fossil sources. It's a byproduct of other industries like making petrol and diesel. And so if you can actually now come across to the right-hand side, you see that the black has disappeared entirely. What I want to talk about is how do you actually practically do that, because I think that that is possible, and that is something that we can get behind, and that's something we could get behind and make Portugal actually one of the leaders in this. It's a matter of will. And so you can see that the vast majority of plastic in 2050 is coming from recycling. And so recycling is an exciting aspect of plastic, as I'll say right at the outset, that more than 95% of all plastic, technically, is recyclable. Now, we've been hearing about words. Now, I'm an engineer. We're going to come back to the numbers in a moment. And words absolutely matter. But actually, recyclable doesn't mean that it's being collected for recycling. It doesn't mean that it is being recycled. And actually, recycled doesn't mean that it is actually being recycled. I'll say that again. Recycled doesn't actually mean that it's being recycled. You know, I don't know if you know, but you know, 50% of the UK's recycled status is actually achieved. You stick it on a ship and you send it to foreign shores with no chain of custody. There's no control as to what happens to it. And I've been to places like Indonesia. I've seen what actually happens to it. And it's landfilled on the side of rivers. And when the rains come, it just washes the landfill into the river and it's out into the ocean. And so of the 12.2 million tons of plastic that is going into the ocean each year, for a very significant chunk of it, read, that's the European plastic, which is called recycled. So words do matter, because that's not what you really thought as a consumer. But I also like these top two bars here, one of which is actually this 315 million tons, which is CO2 based. I love this. If you put plastic, or any material, frankly, into an energy from waste plant, what you're doing is replacing landfilling with sky filling. Because very rapidly what you're doing is actually taking a long-term problem of leachate from a landfill, if it's a controlled landfill, and you're actually burning that material and you're putting it directly into the atmosphere. And you're replacing arguably a long-term problem with a short-term problem. And so what you need to think about is, how do you get that carbon back out of the atmosphere and actually turn it back into oil? Because oil's only just carbon and hydrogen. And with the advent of a lot of free or low-cost electricity, I know it doesn't feel like low cost at the moment, but that's a market thing, right? Because if you actually look now at the cost of electricity coming from wind and from solar, I've seen contracts actually let on wind in the recent years of less than $10 per megawatt hour of electricity. Unheard of. Way lower than getting it from gas or from coal or from any other source over the last 10 years. Forget about price spikes. And so with that low-cost energy, gives you the ability to pump CO2 out of the environment, synthesize it with hydrogen coming from the splitting of water, and you make oil. And therefore, the plastic which comes from that oil is actually absorbing carbon from the environment, and you're turning that material into a plastic, and you're using something which used to be carbon dioxide wandering around in the air. And so you can suddenly see how exciting plastic becomes when you look at this box here. And then coming back to this top box at the top here, coming back to the, if you don't actually burn your plastic in an energy from waste plant, you might also think about the biomaterial. And if instead of burning the biomaterial, you can actually gasify that, go through a process called Fischer-Tropsch, and you make, guess what? Oil. Now the nice thing about that is that already exists. So if you've ever heard of sustainable aviation fuel, now again, words, there is no such thing as any fuel which has got carbon in it is not sustainable. Okay, because if you're going to burn something with carbon in it and create carbon dioxide and put it back into the atmosphere, then that's an act of insanity. So there is no such thing as sustainable fuel with carbon in it. It might be okay if carbon in the environment was at sustainable levels. It is not. It's 220 parts per million for 800,000 years. Now it's at 420 parts per million. And the planet is rocking on its axis, if I can put it that way, from an environmental perspective. And so I love to see this here, where you're actually taking the biomass, turning that into oil, and then turning that oil into plastic, which actually allows you again to absorb carbon from the environment into a product. So let's just drill into that in a little bit of detail. Somebody mentioned the linear economy. Here it is. Today, you start with oil and gas. The width of the line represents the actual mass of the material. And you go to a refinery and you make naphtha. From the naphtha, the polymer producer can produce plastics. At that point, you probably only got 6 or 7 plastics of any importance. They're usually white or colorless in little beads. And then you take these to a compounder, and it's the compounder that puts in all of the magic, because they put in the color. they put in fillers, they put in plasticizers, they put in stabilizers, they put in all sorts of things so that you can turn it into the myriad of items that we use day to day. And of course, we love to use all of these items. We talked about reuse. Reuse is always the best thing. I'm going to build up here what they call a butterfly diagram. Inner circles are good. They are the best. So reuse is always going to be the very best thing to do. But if you can't reuse it, it's out into, it used to be called the waste industry. I love to call it the resource management industry. That is its role. Unfortunately, 88% of all plastic today goes straight out the bottom, and it's either lost, or it's burned, or it's buried. That is a resource that we want to utilize. So good old mechanical recycling, you put your bottle into recycling, and people will take that bottle, particularly if it's colorless, we've just heard about that, particularly if it's PET, and that forms the backbone of mechanical recycling. You wash it, you check that the color is all consistent, and you push it through a dye into making it into more pellets, and those pellets can now be used to make more products. Now, if you thought most plastic bottles become more plastic bottles again, though, there's another little kind of dirty lie from the industry, because the vast majority of PET doesn't end back up as bottles. It's going to end up as, no, not this actually. this one's wool, because you know, this doesn't give me microfibers. But it ends up as clothes. If it's high quality, it's polyester. If it's low quality, it's going to end up as carpets. So that's where most of your bottles will actually end up in. If you think about the other plastic that goes down that route, which is HDPE, particularly if it's a light color, it's a neutral color, then that's going to usually end up in wood replacement products. So think about your decking. Think about the plastic posts that you can now buy for fencing. Think about park benches that you might see. So that's great, because it's still being used as a product. My question is, what do you do with that at the end of its life? Because you're not going to turn it back into another bottle now, that's for absolute certain. Well, actually, not true. Because there are new technologies which are now, over the last 10 years, come about, and these, in umbrella term for these, are chemical recycling. And I just want to break that down a little bit, because when people talk about chemical recycling, first of all, as Paul will know, coming from the chemical industry, you say chemicals, and everybody thinks they're bad. But they're not all bad, clearly. And chemical recycling is actually very, very different. So you have the first one here, and don't forget inner circles are typically good, because what you're trying to do is hold the material at its highest value level. So it started life as oil and gas, relatively low value. It became naphtha, which is higher value. It became polymer, which is higher value. It's then become items, products, which are the zenith of its value, and then it's lost again. And so if you can actually reuse, you're keeping it at its highest value. If you mechanically recycle, what you're doing is going back to the compounders, and they're reusing that polymer. It's still a polymer though, but it still has in it all of the flame retardants and the color and all of the fillers and all of the things that made it very unique for its last use. Now, if you want to make a bottle now into something, you can see that you've still got all of the additives from its last use. And so that's what actually makes it difficult. Purification allows the plastic to go into solution, often in a solvent, not always, but often in a solvent, and that allows you to remove a lot of those additives from the process, and then when you crystallize back out the plastic, then you've actually got much, much purer grades. And if you look at companies like PureCycle, that's what they're doing with polypropylene. But then you've got monomer recycling. And so Ineos is the biggest polystyrene manufacturer in the world. They're working very hard, and I've been involved in this, in taking polystyrene, and you take it back into the monomer, the styrene. And so you take lots of styrene molecules and you stick them together, and that's polystyrene. You can actually chop that molecule back up, and you can take it back to the monomer. And this is a technology which is actually being shown at small scale, and is now gradually being scaled up. But then you've got what I would call feedstock recycling. And this means actually you're taking pretty much any old plastic, and I mean any old plastic. This is the kind of stuff which normally would go into an incinerator. You're converting it back into oil, and it comes back through the refinery, starts the process all over again. I'm sure there's going to be a zillion questions. Let me just finish off. This will be my last but one slide. So when you look forward, and you think about that graph that I showed from the Nova Institute, in the future, the width of the line suggests that actually we're using an enormous amount more plastic than we were before, which is good because it's a lower carbon material, and therefore we should see a consequential decline in metal and in the aluminiums and in glass. But we're not using hardly any oil and gas at all, presumably, hopefully, none. Because most of it is being recycled as these things gather momentum, and they all work in harmony. They all do different things. You can't compare one against the other. You can't put the same stuff that you can put through mechanical recycling, or you don't put the same stuff that you can put through mechanical recycling through feedstock recycling. It wouldn't make any sense. And then on the left-hand side, as you think about a butterfly diagram, this is the biosphere, you can see that you're absorbing whether it's actually biomass, which is going through gasification, then a Fischer-Tropsch process back to free-form crude oil, or you're actually pumping this CO2 that I mentioned out to the atmosphere, synthesizing it with hydrogen. These are the sources for actually topping up the losses and for actually augmenting the inventory, if you like, that's in the circular economy. So out to the bottom, ideally, much, much smaller. Now, I'm sure, well, no, I'm going to just say one more thing, actually. I was very privileged to be part of the new plastics economy. A few years ago, a whole bunch of people, some of those brands that you'll no doubt recognize, actually got together and we posed the question and we said, given the knowledge that we have in the room, how much plastic is currently recyclable? And the answer was, well, if you laid out something like this and you actually sorted out the collection side and you brought all the plastic in an area into one facility, and you actually did the sorting correctly and you routed it down those hoops that I was just showing you in the last slide, and you put it down an optimal route, then more than 95% of all of the plastic in Porto, in Lisbon, is recyclable. The technology is there. I mean, this was 4 or 5 years ago, and that technology is gradually growing. But what it really needs is a very big shot in the backside, as they say, and it needs to actually be invested in. You know, in the 10 or 12 years that I've been doing this, I remember talking to Paul about this and saying, in 2011, plastic in the world, there was 250 million tons of plastic that was producible in the world in a year. On top of that, we have added another 118 million tons of production capacity just in the last 10 years alone. 368 million tons of plastic the world can now produce each year. That has cost somewhere between 700 billion and $1 trillion to build out that capacity. How much money has gone into the recycling of that? Maybe 1,000th? It's probably less than $1 billion has been spent in the world on recycling. So the technologies are there. The question is there the will to actually put this thing together and say, let's actually make plastic the miracle material that it can be. Thank you very much.
Right, yeah, you go and sit over there.
Wonderful. Questions? There's a lot to take in there, but very inspiring to see a blueprint, basically, for where we need to aim.
Regarding the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere to the refinery, how much units of energy are required to produce the amount of plastic to be refined as a proxy compared to what is being done today with oil extraction? Yeah,
and I don't know the precise answer to that off the top of my head, but it's the reason why it's never been done historically. Because obviously, if you were going to use coal or gas to produce the electricity to actually run the process, then the effect is bad. But it depends on having excess wind and excess solar to be able to use zero carbon emissions in the production of the energy to be able to do that. And clearly, you're now at a position where we're getting close to that point where we'll be able to do that.
If I can just chip in here, Portugal is in this fantastic position, and I mean fantastic, because our friends in France refused to allow a gas pipeline to be built from Sines through into France and Germany because they wanted to protect the nuclear industry. So as a result, and Inês was very much involved in this, we have really moved forward on renewables. And I think I'm right that it's about 40% of electricity in Portugal today is renewables. And obviously the government is moving forward very fast. We were going to be, if I got the numbers right, we were going to be 100% in 2030 and 140% in 2040. And those dates are coming forward. Why does that matter? Because if you think about a year, probably for 300, yeah, today is a good day, 330 sort of days, the wind is blowing, there's some sunshine, so renewables will work very well. But for 30 days of the year, you don't have very much wind, you don't have very much sunshine, and so that's when you need to have storage, and that's when the price goes up, because then all that extra capacity has to be paid for. So where we're going to get to very quickly is for most of the year, we will have more or less free electricity. And I'll just repeat that statement. For most of the year, we will have more or less free electricity here in Portugal. At some points in the year, 30 or 40 days, depending on wind and sun, we will have very expensive electricity. So if you're an industry, you want to run during the free period and you don't run when it's expensive. That is fantastic for a recycling business because it means you can use renewable power to run your recycling units. So it's actually very cheap as well as being green.
I saw another question over here.
Great.
Thank you for the brilliant presentation. I have like 3 questions about 3 materials. Fishing gear, because we only see in this type of diagram the domestic recycling, not the fishing gear, because I know that for example in the Pacific garbage land there are 40% of the packaging and the things that are in there are fishing gear, not plastic bottles, not straws, fishing gear. And about the microplastics and nanoplastics right now, because I saw a study, I think it was like 2 months ago, that says that nanoplastics right now can be airborne, so it's like a big issue down there because you can ingest the nanoplastics even if you are not eating anything, so it's like a big deal of it. Can you explain some, if you know, of course, if you know something about this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not surprising, is it, that actually when you actually look at the plastic in the ocean, I think the numbers are 96% of it is on the floor of the ocean. So when people talk about the Pacific garbage patch, they are talking about, you know, less than 1% of the plastic in the ocean. And often people miss the fact that most of it is sat on the bottom. Of that material that's on the top, an awful lot of it is fishing gear, because fishing gear is designed to float. And so unsurprisingly, it floats. And so even when it's discarded. But the materials that are in that are very similar to the type of materials that you actually have in domestic waste. And so there's absolutely no reason why they too can't be processed in exactly the same way. Again, it needs policy and it needs a push. I've been looking at a project in Malaysia, and in Malaysia, actually, if you lose a net out at sea, then you get given a new net. If you bring a broken net back into land, then you've got to pay to get rid of it. And so guess what? You know, and so it's quite interesting on times that, you know, some of the cause and effects. But yeah, absolutely, that material is recyclable. And I know Sea Shepherd are around today, and a lot of that material they're bringing in. The first tranche is, can you mechanically recycle it? And if you can mechanically recycle it, fantastic, eureka. And if you can't, then yes, that's where feedstock recycling comes in, and you turn it back into crude, and you can turn that back into more drinking bottles, if you like. There was another part of your question.
While you're saying, I could just chip in, because just the knowledge I learned last week at the Plastic Summit from the Portuguese plastics industry. There's a very, very, very clever lady, very dedicated, and she's been working with fisherwomen, wives of fishermen, to collect here in Portugal fishing gear, and she's explained to them why this is all important and so on, and they're doing a fantastic job of reclaiming, because it's just a question, as you were saying, if people understand that this is important, they do it. So I don't know any more than that, but I was pretty encouraged. She was pretty credible.
Thank you. Yeah, and so in terms of the microplastic and
now nanoplastic, because scientists right now, it was like in 5 years ago, they see that it's not only microplastic right now, but it's nanoplastic.
It's not only right now microplastics, but nanoplastics too. So yeah, it's like
and I have to say that as a dweller of planet Earth, it's very scary. Now, let's break that down a little bit though, and sort of say, right, is it the plastic that is actually the problem? So it's absolutely a problem at the moment because it's a pathway for actually taking background chemicals, things like DDT and stuff that's actually in the ocean in parts per million, and it tends to attenuate to the particles, and then that gets ingested by the plankton, and the plankton get eaten by the fish, and so you get it in the fatty deposits in the fish. So be careful how much fish you eat every week. You're a seafaring nation.
And mercury, by the way. Mercury, the microplastics, nanoplastics, that kind of chemicals. Yeah.
And I don't know what the answer to that is, frankly. But, I do wear wool and I try to wear cotton. And I think we can all make choices around, what we do with our clothes. And I think this whole run on making clothes which are plastic, you don't need to use plastics in clothes. So I think that as with any kind of material, as the science grows up and makes you realize that actually it has some unintended consequences, we have to address those consequences. And we have to keep coming back to, okay, presumably we want to wear clothes. What's the best material that we want to use? And there are some perfectly good materials. And then you get into, and this is where, universities really need to actually help a lot here because you need to do the LCAs. It's all too easy to say, we've got to go and use cotton.
Can you explain LCA?
An LCA is a life cycle assessment. Okay, so you're actually sitting there and you're saying, okay, if we could take this pathway, then what's the effect going to be, not just on the carbon in the environment, but the acidification of the oceans, on human health, and so on and so forth. There are a number of measures which are actually looked at to actually accurately assess what is the right thing to do for the environment. And so I wouldn't like to actually hazard a guess, as given the water content and the water use in the way that cotton is produced, in comparison to what's the impact of actually using a polyester clothing, and recognizing that that's going to have some influence on micro or nanoplastics. And so I think that at the moment there is a danger that people can just jump on a bandwagon and say everything about plastic is bad. And I'm just here to just say, actually look, any material has some drawbacks. And I think what we have to have is a reasoned debate, and we need universities and people who understand those life cycle assessments to actually help us navigate what are difficult choices. Yeah.
So at this point in the program, I'm going to ask another presenter up on stage, or another speaker, so we can just have a short panel discussion here. There's a few more points that we'd like to go through around accelerating on this paradigm. So I'll ask you to come up and join up on stage. And I will take a seat too. Sorry, now I'll give you the chance to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah.
So, I know you...
Hi everyone, Inês Costa, Associate Partner at Delloite. As I said, before I was Secretary of State for Environment in the last government. And so the issue of plastics and what we can do in terms of curbing plastic consumption is an issue for government. And I was very happy to, maybe I'll sit down right now. And I was very happy to be invited by Planetiers to come to this session and to join Andrew in this forum, because I believe that we are still, despite the technological advances, we are still very much looking at the plastic issue in a linear way. We were talking about grabbing the bull by its horns. It's still linear economy. The issue of plastics is not just an issue of technological advances in order to recycle or to become more efficient. It is also an issue of one word that has been clearly missing in the discussions about sustainability, which is sufficiency. Plastic is still very much a challenge related to degradability. We were talking about micro and nanoplastics and how they can enter environmental systems, the air, the water, the soil. It is an issue of complexity. We maybe need 5 types of plastics, not 500 types of plastics, which render its recycling and reuse quite difficult still. It is an issue also, like Sonia was saying, of language, because like Andrew was saying, recyclable, it's not the same thing as recycled. It's also an issue of getting to that recycled content. For example, currently the European Commission has established only for one type of product the obligatory inclusion of recycled content, which is for PET bottles, up to 25%. In none other product there is any mandate to integrate recycled content. That needs to change, for sure. And it's also an issue of quantity, of mass production, because in the early days, the plastic bag, as you well know, as Leila Karaoglu speaks so well in her speeches, the plastic bag was invented to curb down the consumption of paper products in doing paper bags. It was seen as something light, something that you can, you know, it would hold this shape. You put it in your pocket and you can go with a bag anywhere. The issue is when you turn something which is useful in something which is mass productive and disposable, there is where you take the product too far. So it's not just an issue of chemical recycling, which is a very much debated issue right now in the European Commission. European plastic producers are saying we are willing to invest 7.5 billion euros on chemical recycling until 2030, but that is very good, but it pales in comparison to the 800 billion that plastic manufacturers want to invest in virgin plastic material factories. So it is a systemic issue that needs a systemic approach composed of new technologies, of removing the unnecessary plastic that we use today, of pushing forward in terms of simplicity in the materials which are used to bring down the complexity in order for it to become more feasible to do recycling, not downcycling, like Adrian was talking about. And that is the vision that we are now wanting to imprint as consultants in industry as well. That is the systemic vision that we want to imprint in the industry. Not only on the oil and gas industry, which also needs to benefit from this vision in order to see how their business models can change and get away from fossil fuel consumption, but also in retail, in other consumer-based products and production, in order to really get that message across. Efficiency needs to be coupled with sufficiency in order to have an active move towards. Like, for instance, what Dow is doing with, it is a completely game changer, because Dow, for instance, is championing a business model that says, I own the molecule, I own the plastic molecule. So it is in my best interest that you return to me that plastic molecule so I can use that again. And that is a game changer for instance, chemical recycling or any other business model related that uses plastic as a material.
Great. Shall we?
Yeah.
mindful of time, we're going to get to go and have a break in about 15 minutes. So,
But I think Adrian
you
wants
need
to
that.
say something.
Thank you, first of all. Thank you, Inês, for that.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic, really. If we could throw you off that chair, Richard, and Paula can join us.
Yeah,
It was a mistake. It was a mistake.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
Something about plastic, but I think you
Yeah, so-
more than that. So
Youth, I can't believe it. Wait till I see Antonio and Ben. You're telling me that Sergio's made a mistake.
Yes.
This is proof.
So we have, let's say 10, 15 more minutes to discuss here on the panel that we have.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, Paul, if you've got any reflections there, that just from the last discussion there, or even anything from continuing on from the questions.
I mean, I really want to get questions out. I don't want people to go away saying, well, I wasn't quite sure about that, they didn't really answer that, or whatever. This is an opportunity to ask a real expert like Adrian about what's happening. I will say, sort of following on from Inês's point, that there are moments in life where everything comes together. And in April, the International Energy Agency, as I was saying, which is the watchdog for the rich world on energy, came out with a report, 10 things to do to reduce fossil fuel consumption in response to the invasion. And it made two very important points. It said we must speed up the movement to electric vehicles, and we must speed up the growth of plastic recycling. So this is the world's energy watchdog saying we need to move away from virgin plastic, we need to move away from gasoline and diesel cars. Now, the second bit is really very important, because as Adrian showed, the feedstock for plastics is a product called naphtha, which comes from a refinery. 95% of the product of a refinery is gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and a bit of asphalt, and so on. So if the refinery is no longer producing gasoline and diesel for cars, it shuts down, and there is no naphtha for plastics recycling. If the European Union has banned the sale of new gasoline and diesel cars from 2035, which they are doing, that's fairly clear that that's happening. What that means is nobody in their right mind will be buying a gasoline or diesel car in 2030. Because you buy a new car in 2030 and after 5 years you want to sell it, and the buyer says, why do I want that? I don't want that. That's banned. Look what's happened to diesel. Diesel was 51% of the market in Europe before Dieselgate. It's now 18%. So it's gone down by 2/3 in the space of 7 years. And that's what's going to happen to gasoline and diesel. So what I'm saying is, the good news is there won't be many refineries, so there won't be much naphtha. So if people want to continue to use plastic, they are going to have to move to recycled plastic. As Margaret Thatcher used to say in the UK, there is no alternative. So this is a really positive thing. Now, a second general point, because of our friends at Lipur and others who are here, one of the things we've not done very well, but I want to get going here in Portugal as part of this project, is to get discussion between the waste collectors, the waste processors, the cities, the governments, the plastics companies, Repsol and Galp, about how we do this. Because as Inês and as Adrian was saying, if you think, this side of the room is the chemicals and plastics industry. They're taking the oil, they're turning it into plastics products, and they're selling it to someone. That side of the room is the someone, and they are taking the plastics that's made, and they're selling them, and then they're collecting them, and then they're processing them and putting them in landfill or whatever. Now, unless these two halves of the room sit and discuss together, you will never be able to do this, because you will always go down that value chain, down that value chain. If we want a circular value chain, we have to link up. You know, I almost want you all to get up and hold hands to show what we need to do, because that's the way forward. And the other important thing, before I go to other questions, is this is not a winner and loser exercise. This is an exercise where we all win, but we have to listen to each other. We have to understand, well, if that is really important to Liverpool, how can we make sure that it's still important to Liverpool? If this is important to Superboc, how do we make sure it still happens? Because I want to drink my bock, really do. And I'm sure most of us do. You know, so, but there's a real challenge here. But I am just, you know, I've been in Portugal now 3 years, and we're settled here, we love it. And I really want to make this project work if we can.
Adrian, any final comments?
Well, I was just going to come back to Inês's point about Dow and them wanting to hold on to the molecules. And that goes, it's not really a, we want to be great. It's actually a, we better had, because these molecules are going to become much more scarce. And I think it's a good thing, you know. And I think it's great that they're actually stepping forward, and I think everybody else needs to do a similar kind of thing, because in a funny little way, plastic has been dirt cheap, and plastic has been a great material because it's based on feedstocks which are the byproducts from other things. So Paul has talked about naphtha. It's essentially a byproduct from refining petrol and diesel. Whereas you also get it from ethane, which is a byproduct from fracking in the US. And so you have ships coming across the Atlantic, actually in a continuous loop, so it's a virtual pipeline, bringing ethane into Grangemouth, and most of the plastic made in the UK is coming from ethane. But that's a byproduct from actually, you know, pumping gas out of fracking in North America. And again, that's something that's doomed. And so as these cheap sources of byproducts are going to disappear, so now the feedstocks for more plastics are actually going to be in more short supply, and therefore people will start using electricity, go back to try and pump it out of the atmosphere. They will use biomass instead of burning it in planes and calling it sustainable aviation fuel. And they will use waste plastic. And it'll be because that is the economic way of actually sourcing feedstocks for plastics.
Great. Are there any last? Yes, great.
We have been speaking about about the future in terms of trying to maximize the recycling, and what about remove some of the plastic that we have in the planet? What can be done, and there is any projects to remove those plastic islands in Pacific, or just thinking about what was produced already and what can we do with that?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. And you know, I think first of all the thing is there's got to be a principle. We all remember the days when plastic bags were free, and we always needed plastic bags. And then somebody said, in the UK at least, it's 5 pence. Now, actually 5 pence is actually a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of money, and yet the moment you actually had to buy that plastic bag, people stopped buying the plastic bags. And so the moment you attribute any value to it, then you stop using that. Now, if you flip that round the other direction, so I spent quite a lot of time in places like Indonesia, and we were looking at how do you actually stop plastic going into the rivers? And the answer is that you actually attribute to it just a tiny, tiny value. I remember the days when I were a lad, when to top up the pocket money, you'd go wandering around in the hedgerows and you'd go looking for bottles, and they used to return the glass bottle and used to get the deposit back. You know, people are not going to just deposit plastic into the waterways in Indonesia or in any other country for that matter if there is just a small value attributed to it. And actually the economics are there. So you can build plants now in places like that where you could afford to pay a small amount for that plastic, and people will, and so I always say to people, look, the plastic in the ocean is a disaster. I'll come back to that in one moment. But you don't actually try to mop the floor when the taps are still on, you know, when the bath is overflowing. You know, you've got to stop the taps. So you're putting into the oceans 12.2 million tons of plastic each year. Let's sort it out on land first, and then get it back out of the ocean. And so I love Sea Shepherd. I was talking to the folks earlier, and you see ocean cleanup, and bearing in mind what I said earlier, only 1% of the plastic in the ocean is on the surface. Unfortunately, 95% of it is at the bottom, 4% of it is on the beaches. So we can sort the beaches, you can sort what's on the surface, what hasn't already fragmented down into micro and nanoplastic, clearly. What's on the bottom, unfortunately, is in sediment layer. And I think that we have to, just as a society, we have to say, you know, the Anthropocene was a terrible, terrible time. But what we must make sure is just because we can't do anything about what we've done, that we don't actually keep doing it in the future.
Right. Great. Well, I think we all deserve a break, and thank you very much. But let me warn you that when you come back, you are going to be the stars of the show, because the next stage is around a brainstorming session. So we're going to have some questions for you around how we might get a plastic project like this underway in Portugal. What are the key things? What are the key questions we need to answer? So in between having a cup of coffee or tea or water or something, you know, get your brains in gear, because we need them.
So we take 10 minutes now. Just for information, for those that are listening in online, there will be an online Zoom link that you'll see here on the screen momentarily, so that you can also participate in the interactive co-creation session. So come back here in 10 minutes. And thank you to our panelists here.
Thank you. Oops.